This is the myth of Wayland the Smith. Hello my friends, welcome back to another episode of Deity Tracker, and today I would like to look at Wayland the Smith, Anglo Saxon god of metalworking, some might say, or maybe more of a Nordic, elvish craftsman, or an ancient Indo-European archetype of the crippled smith. Maybe a little bit of a mixture. So I'm going to tell you the story of Wayland the Smith from the poetic Eddas and later tellings, and then I'm going to delve into a little bit of the mythic comparisons and some of the history of this very interesting Indo-European archetype. First, though, last week, or 2 weeks ago now, I was walking the Ridgeway, as some of you may know, and along the Ridgeway, which is Britain's ancient road, ancient road, and along the Ridgeway there is a long barrow, a chambered tomb, burial mound, and it's called Wayland's Smithy. These burial mounds are, this one is about 5,500 years old. They're dotted all over Europe, particularly northwest Europe. There's a lot in Britain and Ireland, France, Denmark. This particular long barrow is called Wayland's Smithy. So this is Wayland's Smithy, chambered tomb. It's one of the very first things on the Ridgeway, very early Neolithic long barrow. It's of the Cotswold 7 type, which are common in this area. There's a bit of folklore attached to Wayland's Smithy. It's said that if you place a coin at the entrance of the barrow and leave your horse overnight and go away, when you come back in the morning, the coin will be gone and your horse will have new shoes, which connects very interestingly to some of the other mythology of this barrow. Wayland is sometimes called the Anglo Saxon god of metalworking. In the Norse Sagas, he's an elf, and there's a very interesting story attached to him, and he supposedly lives under this barrow. There's quite a few references to Wayland the Smith in little scraps of Old English poetry, just little clues here and there. Wayland's name crops up in the Old English story Beowulf, where the hero Beowulf's armour and sword are made by Wayland. They're very, very fine, elvish craft. There's also other little bits and pieces, other little clues. Some of it is from the Frank's casket, which is an Anglo-Saxon box, which has the story of Wayland the Smith probably on it, along with some other symbolism like this t-shirt I'm wearing here. We would not have this story of Wayland the Smith were it not written down in the prose and poetic Eddas. Before I get on to any of the mythological aspects of this and any of the sort of comparisons with other figures of myth, let's first hear the story of Wayland the Smith. Long ago, long ago, in deep time, myth time, which is somehow out of time, there were 3 brothers, 3 princes of the elvish race, some say. Others say they were sons of the king of Finland. Others say they were what we would now call the Sami people, but they come from that part of the world, somewhere in northeastern Scandinavia. And they were going on a long journey. They were looking for a place to live, the 3 of them. And they came through a deep and dark wood called the Mörk Wood. And then they came to a great lake. And it was a nice sort of place. And they thought they would build a house there, a great hall. And the 3 of them lived there. The eldest brother, Slagfid, he was a great warrior. The second brother, Egil, he was a great archer, but the youngest brother, Volund, he was the craftiest of all. He could make all sorts of clever things, traps for animals, and beautiful jewelry, beautiful armor. Now, they made this house at the shore of this lake, and they fished there, they trapped animals, they hunted, they had a good life, free from any trouble from the mortal realms. Now, one day, the three of them were traveling around the lakes, and they came to a lake they had never been to before. And to their astonishment, there, bathing in the water, were three beautiful maidens. Their skin was white like swan feathers, and they were singing to each other strange, beautiful songs of battlefields and the halls of Asgard, and many strange and wonderful things. Then Wayland, the crafty, ever-observant younger brother, noticed that they had three swan feather cloaks that they had discarded by the side of the lake shore, and they were naked, bathing. So what did those three brothers do? What would you do? Like so many in so many tales like this, they stole up and stole those swan feather skins, and then persuaded those three swan maidens to marry them. And these three maidens, they were Valkyries. Valkyries. Most of the time they would be soaring above the battlefield, over the Feast of Crows, and if they weren't doing that, they were drinking mead in the hall of the one-eyed god himself, otherworld beings. But they were now married to the three brothers. Willingly or no, you decide. So they took one each, and the wife of Wayland, her name was Hereford. She was the most beautiful of all. So for 7 years, they lived together, the three brothers and their three wives, and they were happy. They were happy together. But in the 8th year, those swan maidens, they started to get restless, as many of us do sometimes when we settle down, or if our path in life isn't quite in sync with our spirit. I'm sure many of us know the feeling. So they began to get itchy feet. and in the 9th year, 2 of those swan maidens took up their swan feather cloaks and flew off, back to Valhalla, back to the battlefield, back through the doorway into the other world. And the elder 2 brothers, they put on their deerskin capes and their snowshoes and their skis, and they went out searching for their missing brides. And then Herva, she left as well, taking the form of a swan. Wayland was out. He was out hunting, and he came back, and his beloved too had departed. But he didn't chase after Herva like his other 2 brothers. He thought, if she wants to leave, she can leave. If she loves me, she will come back. And night after night after night, Wayland waited for his beloved to return to him, his sweet Valkyrie, his sweet swan maiden. Now, he was not waiting without hope. You see, Herva had left Wayland a ring that Wayland had crafted for her. Beautiful thing it was, made of gold and set with red agate stones. It had swan motifs carved around it in an interlacing pattern. It was beautiful, beautiful object. In his devotion, perhaps you might say his mania, he set about carving identical versions of this swan ring, this ring of red gold. He made another and another and another, always seeking to improve on the design, a little bit more intricate, a little bit more lovely, just so if his beloved did return, she would be able to witness his devotion to her. 700 copies of this ring he made as the days turned to weeks, turned to months, turned to years, and he hung them on a cord between two beams in the great hall that he was now the sole custodian of. Now, one day, news of Wayland's isolation reached the ears of the king of the Swedes. His name was Nithad. And Nithad decided that he wanted to capture Volund and seize all of his precious gold, his jewelry, his armor, his fine swords of elven craftsmanship. So he set out by secret ways with a small band of elite warriors. No armor, they were just lightly clad with swords and long daggers, no great axes, and he even took with him his young family, his wife, his beautiful but very young daughter, and his two young boys. And they set off in boats and by forested ways, and eventually they found the hall of Wayland, of Volund. He was not in. He was out checking his traps, and his trap had caught a bear, so he was busy skinning that bear, Wayland. And meanwhile, King Nithad and his band of elite warriors snuck into Wayland's hall with his wife, and they eyed all this gold and jewels and wondrous things, and his wife's eyes widened with greed, and she reached out. "Not yet," said Nithad. "We will wait. We will wait for Wayland." "Just one ring," said the queen. "One ring. He will not notice." And she took one of those rings from the 700 identical swan gold rings that were suspended from a cord in the hall. And then they crept out and waited with their swords drawn and their shields, hunkering down, hiding in the scrub, waiting for Wayland to return. And return he did with the carcass of bear meat and its skin. And he returned and hung up the flesh of the bear to cure and laid out its skin in front of the hearth by the fire. And then he lay down to sleep. Then he saw, just like a dragon hoarding his gold, that one of those rings was missing. He knew every single ring, and he knew the ring that was taken was the very original ring. Only he and his beloved Herva would know. It was a sign. His beloved had come and taken his ring. She would return to him, maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day. He went to sleep on that bearskin rug, full of joy, full of swan-laden dreams of the other world. Sorry day, because he heard a sound. The door of his great hall being forced open. Was it Herva? Was it his beloved? Suddenly he was faced, what's this? With armoured men, 24 in his hall, spears and swords pointed at his throat. And then he tried to move and found his arms chained. He was bound. King Nithad approached, and so did his queen. And so did Nithad's young daughter, Mjodhild. And glittering on her finger was the ring he had made for his love, Herva. Suddenly realization dawned on Wayland. He had been tricked, and he snarled and tried to snatch the ring from Mjodhild, but the chains were yanked from round him, and he was beaten. A spear butt he was battered to the floor, and his chains were strengthened around him, and he snarled and hissed. And the young Mjodhild, she must only be a girl of 12 or 13 years old, she was frightened. And Nithad said, "What do we do to slaves that misbehave?" And young Mjodhild said, "We cut their sinews, father." "That's right." And Nithad nodded to one of his men, and with that a sword was drawn, and Wayland's hamstrings were cut behind his knees, and he screamed as the blood poured out, and he wailed in anguish, both for the pain but for the loss of his herva. He didn't care anymore, and he lost consciousness. When Wayland awoke, he was still bound. His legs were bandaged, aching, the pain, numbing pain. He was crippled now for life, and he could hear seabirds, seagulls. He looked around. His clothes were torn. He was on a rocky island, slimy seaweed-covered rocks, the sea just there, seabirds wheeling in the air, crapping all over him. He was there, he was hungry, he was cold, he was wet for a long time before a boat came. It was King Nithad and a few of his men, and Nithad said it like it was. You are now my slave. I will build you a smith, a forge here where you will do your work. Everything you need, precious metals, tools, food, wine, you can have it all. But you will make me the finest jewelry for my wife and daughter, the finest swords and armor for myself and my sons and my warriors. You will make the finest things that have ever been made. And you will design your own prison here on this island called Sea Station, away from the coast, a little way from the coast of Sweden. So, Wayland had no choice. He was captive. He relied on the hospitality of King Nithad, his captor. So he designed a labyrinth, a maze, and it was cut into the rock. It was designed to contain Wayland. It was so ingeniously designed that Wayland himself barely knew his way out, but Nithad, of course, had the design. It was made so no other jealous kings or chieftains could find the smith Wayland. They would not be able to get onto that island. And Wayland, like a tame slave, began to make the most wonderful things. His heart was torn by the loss of his herva, so he threw himself into his work, threw himself like seed into the furrow. And he made rings, he made armor, he made great helms, just like the wonderful things in the Sutton Hoo ship burial. He made beautiful swords and spears, the like of which had never been seen. Elven craftsmanship. So things went on like this for months, years, and Wayland became, I suppose the term would be Stockholm Syndrome. He became fairly meek, fairly docile. Sometimes the king would visit, sometimes with his wife, sometimes his young daughter or his sons, sometimes dignitaries or visiting royals from other lands, and he would say, come, look at our tame smith that we have captive in a labyrinth of his own design. Look at the wonderful things he makes. Isn't he a clever, clever slave? Sometimes Wayland would find a white feather somewhere in a desolate place on that island, on some rock, and his heart would leap. He would think it was a swan feather. He would think it was his beloved Valkyrie, Herva, that had come back to rescue him, and she would carry him away into some other world. But alas, no, it was just a seagull feather or a gannet or some other seabird. But Wayland had an idea. He began to collect these feathers. There were a lot of seabirds on this island, and he would collect the feathers, collect the feathers, collect the feathers, day after day after day, and keep them in a secret place. One day, King Nithad's two young boys decided they would make a journey to see their father's slave, the smith Wayland. So they took to a little boat and rowed across the short, stormy stretch of water between the mainland of Sweden and the island where Wayland was imprisoned. And they made their way through the labyrinth into the forge at its centre. And there was the humble, crippled smith on his crutches, quite harmless. And the boys, they were quite haughty, they were proud, they were princes, so they would walk around and say, what's this? What does this do? Tell me about this. And Wayland would talk them through his various contraptions or his new armor he was making for their father, or this or that. And then the boy's eyes spied a wooden chest in the corner of the forge, and they said, "What's in there?" And Wayland said, "Ah, many, many, many fine treasures and jewels. Not even your father knows what's in that chest. Open it. We'd like to see." "Of course, my boys, of course, my princes," said Wayland, and he went to open the chest. The key. I've misplaced the key. I will find it. I'll tell you what, my boys, seeing as you're good lads, come back tomorrow and I will open the chest for you and give you each a gift of your own choosing from the chest. But, as I say, your father doesn't even know about this chest, so tell no one. It's just our little secret, yes? Good boys. I'll see you tomorrow. And with that, the kindly smith bid the two young princes on their way, and they rode back. Sure enough, the next day they returned, eager to see what was in the chest. And Wayland had found the key. "I found it, my boys. Come, see what's inside." And he opened the chest, and they looked in. Look a little deeper. The finest things are at the back, and they craned their long, swan-white necks to look at the glittering jewels and gold that were at the back of the chest. And then Wayland slammed the lid shut. That night, the night previously, he had made a blade to go across the edge of the chest, and their heads chopped off and rolled into the chest. Ha ha! Wayland gleefully set to work. Out of their skulls he made goblets, gifts for the king and queen. Out of their eyes they made precious jewels for the queen, and out of their teeth they made necklaces for Bjordehild, the king and queen's daughter. And he buried their bones, and of their flesh he made meat pies, and of their blood he brewed beer and wine. Of course, when the boys did not return, the island was searched by the king's men, and they searched everywhere, all over the forge, in every recess of the labyrinth. But that labyrinth was tricky, and they did not search under the mud beneath the forge itself, where those boys' bones were laid. Wayland put on a great show of sympathy. "They've been lost, they've died, but I only saw them the other day." In the end, when their bodies couldn't be found on the island, it was assumed that they had lost their lives at sea. It was a treacherous strait of water, and they were young lads. The king and queen were dismayed. They held a funeral for the boys, even though they never found their bodies. "But our slave, our smith, has sent us these gifts," said the king and queen. "This wonderful gold and silver goblet. What fine craftsmanship. And even wine to drink from. We will toast the death of our sons. And look at these jewels. Look at the blue sapphires set within. They look just like eyes. Look at this beautiful necklace that we lay upon the neck of our beautiful daughter. This is some consolation for the death of our sons. We have a very ingenious slave." Now, sometime after this, the young princess, who was kind of coming of age now, she had broken her ring, the ring her father had given her long, long ago, the very ring that Wayland had made for his beloved Herva. So, she made a journey in secret to Wayland's island. She wasn't scared of Wayland. Her father had told her that he was a monstrous cripple, but she knew that he was just a humble, sweet, gentle old soul. He used to roll around his workshop on his wheelchair that he had made himself, or maybe hobble around on his crutches. And she went to visit Wayland and said, "Please don't tell my father. I've come here in secret, but my ring, it's broken. Could you fix it? Shh, don't tell Daddy, please." Shh, shh, my sweet child, of course, it will take me not long. An hour, 2 hours, I'll fix a bit there, fix a bit there. Meanwhile, sit down here, have some pie, nice, good meat pie. Have some beer. It was good beer. Beautiful drunk it. It tasted different, like a dark mead. And she ate the pie and drank the beer, and she began to just feel a little bit, just a little bit soft and floaty. And she was looking at Wayland, bent over his forge, mending her ring. And she thought to herself, if you forget the crippled, disformed legs, he's quite handsome in a way. And that was a thought she had as she drifted into a deep lethargy. She awoke on a stone-cold, hard floor of Wayland's forge, looking up at the blackened ceiling. She tried to open her mouth, but no sounds came out. She tried to move, and found she couldn't move at all. There was a clink, 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 and then a tsk, and then a heavy breathing as Wayland crawled onto her chest and whispered in her ear, "That pie you ate was the flesh of your brothers. The beer you've drunk was mixed with their blood, and a little something extra. Cut his hamstrings, you said. I've not forgotten. And this ring," and he slipped it off her finger, "is not yours, you thief. This belongs to my bride, Herva. Well, if you are going to steal my wife's ring, then you will do the duty of a wife." Bjornhild tried to scream, but she couldn't. She was paralyzed as her dress was torn, and she could feel Wayland forcing his way into her, and he raped her again. When the ordeal was finally over, she did pass out, and she woke again. This time, she could hear the sounds of seagulls. Her dress was all torn. She awoke battered and bruised and smeared down by the shore, with her boat just lopping on the waves. She crawled. She had the use of her limbs now, tears in her eyes, sobbing into her boat, her body broken, full of shame. And she rowed, a broken woman, back to the shore of her father. But then there was a cry from above. A great winged creature cast a shadow over the water above her and landed on some seagull shit-covered rock. "Look at what I've become." It was none other than Wayland, but he was different. He was deformed. He had huge wings and this suit of strange armor, a helmet, and his blue eyes shone out of it. This armor was riveted to her body, and on the ring, on his finger, the ring, Herva's ring, seemed to glow, and it seemed to animate this suit of metal, this ingenious thing that Wayland had created, and the wings flapped. All those seagull feathers he had collected and sewn together in glue and mud and sick and spit and bile, and sewn together in this wonderful gold and metalwork suit that gave him the power of flight. And he said, "See what I've become, you thief, you, Björnhild, you have given me this form, and for that I thank you." And he took off into the air, and he said, "You in your belly carry our child." And he flew off, laughing, 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 to the palace of King Nithad. And then he perched above the hall there, on the roof of the hall. And King Nithad was there, and so was his queen, and so were his men-at-arms. And he said, "Nithad, see, it is I, Wayland. I killed your sons and sent you their skulls as goblets. You have drunk their blood in the wine I have given you, and I have raped your one and only daughter, and she carries my child in her belly. What? Said King Nithad. Archers, fire! And all the archers fired, but Wayland took off, screeching like a bird and soaring, and the archers couldn't hit him. But King Nithad had one prized archer. According to some stories, it was Wayland's own brother Egil, who Nithad had captured some time before, and he loosed an arrow, and it struck Wayland right in the breast. But Wayland was ready for this. He had a bladder of the king's son's own blood in there, and the blood spilled out and rained down on King Nithad, and he went, yes, die, birdman. And Wayland said, that's the blood of your own sons you're licking. No! And Nithad fell to the floor, and Wayland swooped around, mocking the king and his queen, who were broken people. And then he flew off. Eventually, Princess Bodehild came to shore, and Nithad said, tell me it isn't true. Tell me what Wayland has said is not true. Alas, father, she said, it is true. I sat with Wayland on the island, and I should not have done. And I could not resist him. I could not resist him. Punishment too harsh, some might say. Where is Wayland now? Stories differ. Some say he found his brothers Egil and Slagfid and raised an army from the king of the Finns and went to Sweden and decimated the whole land, Wayland flying ahead of a whole army and killed King Nithad and married Princess Bodehild. Don't know how she feels about that. Other stories say Wayland flew straight into Elfheim, straight into the realm of the elves, where he made wonderful precious things for all the princes of the elves, and some of them found their way onto the fingers of mortal princes and are buried in burial mounds in the earth to this day. Others say he flew into Valhalla and was reunited with his beloved Herva again, and sits to this day at the right hand of the one-eyed god himself. Others say that he flew out of the myth world and into history and landed on a hillside in present-day England and built a forge there, Wayland's Smithy. And he became gradually invisible, not of this world, but he still carried on his craftsmanship, and you could hear hundreds and hundreds of years later the sound of a hammer hitting an anvil up on the Ridgeway, issuing forth from Wayland's smithy. Legend has it he made the shoes for Uffington White Horse, the great chalk horse on the hillside. Legend has it that if you leave a coin on Wayland's smithy and your horse unshod, it will be shod by morning. So that is the story of Wayland the Smith. So, rather a lot to unpick there. That version I told there is from the poetic Edda, probably written down in around the 10th century. The English versions of this are a little earlier, a few hundred years earlier. I tried to use the old English names where I can, because the Anglo Saxon pantheon doesn't really get enough attention. We focus too much, I feel, on the Icelandic stuff, which is late. It's late. It is very late. Some obvious parallels here with other myth, as I'm sure a lot of you have noticed in Greek mythology. Kind of a clue as to how old this is when it has echoes in very, very early Greek myth, like Daedalus, the Greek craftsman, the great inventor, who was imprisoned by King Minos and made the labyrinth for the Minotaur. He also made wings for him and his son Icarus to escape across the sea, and Icarus flies too close to the sun and falls in the ocean. I'm sure we're all familiar with that story, but this clear parallels there with a kind of inspired craftsman. Also clear parallels with other crippled smiths. Think Hephaestus, think Vulcan from Greek and Roman mythology, both crippled, lame smiths. There's a few reasons for this archetype of the crippled smith that I'll get onto in a minute. But other parallels here as well, because there are many. The Swan Maidens. It's interesting that they're Valkyries. Valkyries aren't normally considered Swan Maidens. So I would say the Valkyrie part of this is a later insertion in the story, because this Swan Maiden motif in folklore and myth is a very widespread and therefore probably a very old one. Think from Irish myth, the children of Lear. Lear it was an Irish king, one of the children of Danu, the Tuatha De Danann, whose children were turned to swans by their wicked stepmother with the wand of a druid, and they remained swans for 900 years. You will also notice the motif of the skin stealer. This happens a lot. On the island of Britain, it's often selkies, seal beings that live beneath the waves. I've told that story on this channel. I'll put a link to it. In Grimm's fairy tales, classic European mythology, there's the story of the 6 swans, another version of this sort of swan, shape-shifting swan imprisonment story. Sometimes in folklore it's called the maiden that goes in search for her brothers. Again, I've told that story on this channel, so more about the power of the sacred feminine in that, and what it is to be a swan in terms of mythopoetics. So this very old theme of the Swan Maiden, combined with this story of the wounded smith and this quite weird, vengeful god Wayland, or elf, I suppose I should say. In the Norse Saga, Weyland is described as a prince of elves. I guess a bit about terminology. Elves are elves are also like dwarfs. They're not divine. They're not mortal. They're sort of in this third space. So they're semi-divine, non-human, but often the line is blurred, especially in very early stuff between sort of human and non-human entities. And elves are crafty, like dwarfs. They make things. In Norse pantheon, there's a distinction between light elves, so elves proper, and dark elves, which are also sometimes called dwarfs, that are sometimes underground. Sometimes they're small and bearded, but that's more of a later thing. Whereas elves are, tall and look like Orlando Bloom and fire bows. I jest. So this idea of the wounded smith, this is ancient thing. I mentioned Hephaestus, the Greek smith god. Interesting parallels here. There's different variants of this story. Sometimes Hephaestus is born lame, born crippled and deformed. So Hera, the queen of the gods, in disgust, his own mother flings him from Olympus, and he lands sometimes in the sea and lives under the sea for a while. Subconscious realm. In other versions, he's born completely fine, but Zeus is jealous because Hera's conceived him without him. More of that sort of rivalry between Zeus and Hera. So Zeus casts Hephaestus down, and he breaks his spine on a mountain, and that's why he's crippled. He's eventually invited back into the realm of the gods because all this amazing craftsmanship he's been making sort of eventually trickles up to Olympus. Word spreads. So this idea of a crippled smith, very old one. Some people give sort of quite pragmatic or prosaic reasons for this that have something to them. I'm always slightly nervous of like reductive X equals Y explanations for mythic themes, because there's normally lots of things in the constellations of symbology and myth and meaning that all tie in like golden threads. There's never one single explanation. But this is interesting. So this is a Bronze Age myth. This is an Indo-European myth. That's why you have it in Ireland, in Scandinavia, in England, in ancient Greece. All the descendants of the Indo-European immigrants that came in with the metalworking and Bronze Age into Europe all those thousands of years ago. So Why are smiths often crippled? A lot of reasons for this. Some people say that they are purposefully hamstrung by their own community because they're incredibly useful members of the community, so you don't want them to escape. Dark. There's not really any evidence for that, but it kind of makes sense. Others say they're often crippled because of the work they do is very hard. You know, you're around poisons like sulfur and arsenic a lot of the time in early bronze and copper smelting, so that they might often be deformed. There's this strange ambivalence that goes on as well, isn't it? Because there's something divine about metalworking. There would have been to early peoples making a sword out of a stone. The sword and the stone is a divine thing, but it's also a diabolical thing. Vulcan, where we get the word volcano, associated with sulfurous smells and pyroclastic flows that destroy cities and that hot stuff from under the ground that burns you. They're also noisy and smelly blacksmiths. They're kind of social outcasts, but they produce these wonderful things as if by magic. So lots of different things going on there. It's interesting that Hephaestus also occupies a sort of middle area between gods and men, a bit like elves. So interesting parallels here. So returning to Wayland's Smithy, because this is part of my folklore of the Ridgeway, this video. And Wayland's Smithy is a Neolithic long barrow on the Ridgeway, as I said at the beginning. This is a early Neolithic. This is 5,000 years old or earlier. The people that made Stonehenge, the megalith builders, the people that made the long barrows were already their ancestors. They were already 1,000 years dead or more by the time Stonehenge and Avebury were created. So ancient features in the landscape. These long barrows were probably to do with ancestor worship, or may have been to do with veneration of the ancestors, veneration of the dead that look after us in the life. Also probably boundary markers and all sorts of reasons why were important. By the time the Indo-Europeans, the Beaker people, arrived on these islands with their Bronze Age technology and their smith and metalworking, these features had already been in the landscape for thousands of years, and they wouldn't have known what the hell this was about, but they still clearly venerated them. And it wasn't until the Anglo Saxons arrived that the story of Weyland would have been attached to this burial mound. But it does fit in a weird sort of way. It fits, it does fit. In Germanic-speaking areas, you know, like Germany, like Scandinavia, these burial mounds, because they do exist in that part of the world as well, there's less of them than further west, but they do exist. But they're generally negative associations. They're generally associated with the restless dead, maybe a Barrow wights, or Draugr, or some kind of a vampiric entity, or reanimated corpse, or ghost that will walk the land at nightfall and do bad things. I once came across one of these burial mounds in Denmark, in the middle of a forest, and I learned from a local that its name was the Witch Grabber, rough translation, because an invisible witch lived in there that would come out and grab children and take them back and eat them. So negative connotations. Whereas in, say, for example, Ireland, there's generally more positive connotations to these burial mounds. They are the dwelling place of the she, the others, the fairies, or, as we might say in Old English, elves. So there's a link here. In Irish mythology, usually later mythology, the Tuatha De Danann, the old gods of the Bronze Age, when they were defeated by the Gaels, our ancestors, they were banished to under the sea or under burial mounds, and the burial mounds became portals. But as time went on, they kind of diminished in stature. The Tuatha De Danann were great divine beings, and then the she become they're sort of human sized and invisible, and then in much later folklore they become diminutive fairies, you know, the good folk. So we see how things change, and the fairies are the folk that live beneath the mound. It's interesting then that an Anglo-Saxon story about an elf has attached itself to a burial mound, perhaps influenced by the existing British culture that would have been more sort of Celtic. This is just a theory of mine that I'm thinking of just now. Interesting. Other burial mounds nearby are also associated with Anglo Saxon divinities, like Adam's grave, just a few miles away from Wayland Smithy, that was called Wodin's Bjork, Wodin's Barrow, Odin's Barrow. Odin, of course, being god associated with the underworld, so fitting there, but not a demonic entity, not a Draugr or white or ghost or goblin or orc that lives in the Barrow, but a god. So clearly, these burial mounds were perhaps more venerated by the Anglo Saxons than they were back in Scandinavia or Germany. So yeah, interesting idea. Now, when I was walking the Ridgeway recently, I met a bloke on a bicycle, a contemporary pagan, that said he met a guy in a nearby village of Uffington, that said he knew why the legend of Wayland Smithy came about. He said he reckoned it was his great granddad in the 1930s, who was a blacksmith and a bit of a trickster, who used to go up there and shod people's shoes as a joke. And that's how the legend of Wayland the Smith grew up. I'll share a bit of the clip here if you like.
Okay, his great granddad was a blacksmith in the 30s.
Yeah.
Okay, and you used to be able to take your horse to there and leave it overnight, and it would magically get shod.
Yes.
You know yeah. It was his granddad, he reckons. He used to be a drinker, and his brothers used to be blacksmiths. They used to go there.
You're joking.
As a bit of a giggle, they would do people's horses.
Sadly, it's probably not true because the legend of the Invisible Smith is at least 300 years old. But I like this idea that local tricksters keep folklore going by doing naughty things. It kind of is in fitting with the mythos of Wayland the Smith. Last thing before I leave you about Wayland. In my version of this story, I described a sort of mechanical flying suit. That seems to be the way of later stories. If anyone is reminded of Iron Man, as in from the Marvel franchise, Tony Stark, you'd be right. I don't know whether the creators of Iron Man had ever read the story of Wayland, but this is subconscious imagery. So I think, it's feeding in there even to the modern mythos of Iron Man. He's wounded, isn't he? He's got that heart wound. He makes himself this suit that makes him like a god, but he's actually just a frail man inside. Really struggles with his own psychology. Really interesting Wayland and wounded Smith Hephaestus parallels there. Hephaestus, by the way, he even made himself autonoma, a golden handmaidens to help him walk, just like Iron Man's suits. So really interesting modern parallels there. However, there's some suggestion that much earlier myths of Wayland were more, less prosaic and a bit more shamanic. So perhaps he didn't make a metal suit for himself. Perhaps he actually turned into a swan or had a swan feather cloak or a falcon feather cloak or a seagull feathered cloak that made him change shape. Remember, the Norse goddess Freya has one of these that she lends to both Odin and Loki so they can fly about on their mischief. So a connection here to an earlier thing that feels a bit more quote-unquote shamanic. So perhaps that's the true version of the story. Roland, when he gets his ring back, has the power of transformation. It's also interesting that Volund, as well as being described as an elf, is also described as Sami, as Finnish, because that is also a more native shamanic culture that rubbed up against early Norse culture. So maybe that's an interesting thing in history that has bled into this story. Last thing, very last thing. As you know, if you've watched my channel before, in a lot of ancient art and symbology, water birds or water-going animals represent the other world. It's because things like swans can walk on land, swim on water, and fly in the sky. That represents the upper world, this middle world, and the underworld. So they are transcendent beings. They have a foot in all three worlds, shamanic entities. So perhaps Wayland has transcended his imprisonment there at the end by taking on swan form. So this is perhaps a spiritual story about how we as humans, vengeful, weird, broken humans imprisoned in this mortal form, can transcend to this other state. Starting to sound a bit Buddhist there. On that note, this is from Dior's Lament, that the poem, and this is the scrap we have of the Weyland story. It's so interesting that we can be pretty sure that the Old English version of this story was the same as the Old Norse because of how similar the clues are. Makes me think that sometimes academics are too conservative in going, oh, there's no connection between those just because we haven't unearthed the Frank's casket yet, for example. But this is Dior. Wayland, the steadfast warrior, knew what it meant to be banished. He suffered miserably. Nithad had him prisoned and pined him and bound with supple sinew bonds, a far better man. That's Wayland. But that passed off, and so may this. Beodahil's brother's death did not crush her spirit so much as her own wretched condition when she knew she was heavy with child. Never afterwards did she rejoice, but for thought of what should befall. But that passed off, and so may this. That passed away, and so will this. That refrain is repeated again and again in this beautiful Anglo Saxon poem. This too will pass. This is often associated with Buddhism, this phrase, the acceptance of the transience of life, both suffering and good things. Clearly, the Anglo-Saxons, we often think in popular culture as Anglo-Saxons as brutish warriors. Beautiful poetry the Anglo-Saxons wrote, and clearly had a good sense of the transience of life and how nothing is permanent, my friends, and no suffering will last. Perhaps this is a positive message to take away from the story of Wayland the Smith. My friends, I will leave you with some more folklore of the Ridgeway here. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you to my Patreons. I'll see you next time.
Must have done about 10 miles.